Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now, today is going to be a little bit different, and it's really in response to a question that has been asked quite a few times now. And this question happens to be, why does a chap in New Zealand model British Railway outline? So yes, I model British Railway outline 00 gauge, and the question has come up a number of times as to why I don't model New Zealand railways, for example. So it really comes down to two main reasons, and the first reason is basically availability. I generally prefer to operate RTR, ready to run stock and kit sets and things like that, as opposed to scratch building everything. So when I was a young lad, my dad bought my first train set, and it was a Lima train set implying a British Railways locomotive, which unfortunately looked very American looking. And I think all the stock in the wagons were HO scale. Now, Lima models have been around in New Zealand for many decades, and also Hornby as well, even going back to the Triang days and Hornby Triang and so forth. They have been quite predominant players in the New Zealand model train market. So that is probably really the key reason as to why I model British Railways, simply down to availability here in New Zealand. And it sort of leads on to the other side of the coin, that being New Zealand Railways, and the fact that there is a very limited amount of stock and availability of ready-to-run models based on New Zealand Railways in New Zealand. So I know that the Fleischmann make a series of model railway coaches and locomotives, but from my understanding, I believe they are actually an HO scale and so forth. They're not very accurate at all in terms of scale and detail. So one of the reasons I believe that there is very little in the way of ready-to-run stock based on New Zealand Railways is because of the track gauge here in New Zealand, and in effect really it imposes an unusual scale on when it comes to modelling New Zealand Railways. So here in New Zealand, our track gauge is actually narrow gauge, 3 foot 6 inch gauge. So that in itself creates a bit of a dilemma when it comes to the scale of modelling in NZR. And I thought what would be the easiest way to demonstrate this. So I actually set up a wee diagram comparing the difference between New Zealand Railways and UK Railways, and also what the equivalents end up being for modelling either one of these gauges. And we'll just bring that to the screen now, and I'll run through sort of basic outline of what I researched. So looking at the track gauges in more detail, I have on the left hand side two side profile views of shunting locomotives. Now the top one is a New Zealand locomotive, and the bottom one of course is the British Railways Class 08. Now I have scaled these two drawings to actually be in scale with each other. So this is theoretically how they would appear, and there's not a huge amount of difference in the size Lengthwise, they're very similar. The Class 08, of course, is a higher locomotive. Now, if we look up in the top right-hand corner, we can actually see how they appear side by side on a front end view, and also the comparison between the two gauges. So New Zealand's narrow gauge, 3 foot 6 inch, and then of course the British standard gauge of 4 foot 8.5. And the widths of the two locomotives, the actual frame is very similar, but of course you can see the height is significantly different. Now, in terms of modelling, as you can see in the bottom right corner, we have the comparison of the two gauges if you're using the OO or HO gauge track of 16.5 millimeters. Now, if you wanted to accurately model the New Zealand railways using the HO or OO track, of course the scale difference is quite significant, and we have 1 in 64 scale compared to OO gauges 1 in 76. So this really sort of reinforces what I have been saying in regards to when it comes to modelling New Zealand railways. If you want to do it accurately using the S scale, or SN42 to be precise, really everything has to be scratch built. There is, as I mentioned, there is a number of off-the-shelf products, but generally really 80-90% you're going to be scratch building, and that's just really not a route that at the time I wanted to go down, and that's where we have it. So based on all of that information, you can come to the conclusion really that to model a New Zealand Railways outline is definitely a lot more complicated than just simply going down to the model store and buying a Hornby or Bachmann locomotive straight off the shelf. So the next reason for modelling in British Railways here in New Zealand, and for those of you who model New Zealand Railways, you may want to actually switch off now, because I'm not going to be overly kind about my impressions of New Zealand Railways in general, and unfortunately because of this, this is the other reason I choose not to model New Zealand Railways. So I thought how best to demonstrate my opinion of New Zealand Railways than possibly maybe to compare two video clips, one showing a New Zealand train in operation and another showing some British Railways trains in operation. Now, the New Zealand footage I took some time ago, it might have even been before COVID-19 reared its ugly head. Now, the British Railways clips are compliments of Richard from St Michael's Hill Model Railway, and I'll pop a link in the description. He has his own channel, and a very good channel at that, and I often find myself heading over to his channel for ideas and inspiration. So thank you, Richard, for offering to provide some video footage of some British Railways trains in action as well. So we'll switch over to this now, and you can be the judge for yourself on this one.
So everyone, get your thrills. This is New Zealand Railways in action, and it is a retrofitted locomotive with aluminium frame windows. There we go. That's your frills. That's New Zealand Railways.
So the particular locomotive that I caught in action on the railway line just north of Christchurch here is an old DX locomotive, originally built in 1972, so almost as old as me actually. I'll be coming up for 50 years old in a couple of years' time. So I understand in 1993 some of these DX locomotives went through a quite extensive rebuild, and you can see there in the top corner what they originally used to look like, and the DXR, which is a refurbished version of the original locomotive. The 1993 refurbishment, I think they might have even gone as far as replacing the engine, and of course they completely rehashed the cab, but I think the main sort of body sides remained intact. So to me, the locomotive's a little bit of a Frankenstein. It's kind of made up of all sorts of bits and pieces, and as a joke, I kind of feel like, well, the bull bars that they have on the front of this locomotive look like they've been actually taken off a truck. Now, I'm sure that is to assume that the cab itself is not strong enough to withstand a collision. The cab itself, or the new cab rebuild that was done in 1993, looks like it was inspired by the 1972 version of the Kenworth truck cab over, with the dual windows and windscreen wipers and so forth. Very square and boxy, and I'm convinced that the side windows that they've used on this cab are simply aluminium frame windows from somebody's kitchen. So that is where my impressions lie in terms of New Zealand railways and the New Zealand railway locomotives. Now, interestingly, only 3 years after the New Zealand Railways DX was introduced, British Railways was introducing the Class 43 HST. So even though there is only a 3-year gap between the introduction of these two locomotives, which incidentally are still in operation on both rail networks, there seems to be quite a vast difference in the technology gap. Now, the HST was originally known as the Intercity 125. Right, so that was my comparison between New Zealand Railways and British Railways, and as you can see, there is quite a considerable difference. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a lot of merit that can be given to New Zealand Railways, and that really sort of comes in the form of the scenery in which New Zealand Railways travels through. And I guess because of our terrain being very rugged, the narrow gauge railway was probably the better choice, and it has certainly led to some very exceptional journeys through our landscape with absolutely stunning scenery, lots of tunnels, massive viaducts and all of that kind of stuff. So really, at the end of the day, I think New Zealand Railways has sort of become more of a tourist attraction than simply a way of getting from A to B. So I hope you enjoyed that video. I know it was a lot of talking and not a lot of video footage in itself, but it certainly gives a background into why Station Road exists here in little New Zealand, and also a little bit of a background into our local New Zealand railways as well. So thank you all for watching, and take care everyone. Look after yourselves, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.